Well, thanks for being with us here on Morning Live. Now, today, South Africa commemorates Human Rights Day, which is, of course, a day also recognized by the United Nations as the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which contributed to the adoption of the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Now, Human Rights Day in South Africa was declared a public holiday in 1994, and it was decided to hold it every year on the 21st of March, the day of the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960. Now, on that day, at least 69 people died and over 180 were wounded when police fired on a peaceful crowd that had gathered in protest against the country's past laws at the time. Now, this year, South Africa is commemorating the event under the theme, Deepening a Culture of Social Justice and Human Rights. And to help us discuss the significance of this day, we join now virtually by the regional representative of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Southern Africa, Abigail Noko. Ms. Noko, thanks for your time and welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning to you and good morning to all the viewers, and happy Human Rights Day.
Now, Ms. Noko, for South Africa, Human Rights Day is a somber moment because it reminds us first and foremost of the massacre that took place in Sharpeville on this day in 1960. But what does it mean in the global context for the global community, the purpose of International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination?
Well, I think it's important to underscore, as you had in the opening, that Sharpeville was in fact a watershed moment for the anti-racism movement. And I'd really like to pay tribute to those survivors and massacres and their families for the resilience that they have shown in the face of such a, dramatic tragedy, really. I've had the opportunity to meet with some of the survivors and their families, and each time I'm really struck by the deep scars that continue to run within that community, but also the determination that they have to keep their story alive in an intergenerational manner through performances and the like. I think we have learned not only in South Africa, but in the world, especially the idea that each one of us has an important contribution to make in fighting inequality. They have fought against oppression in South Africa, but they also contributed to this global anti-racism movement. And it's for this reason that we also commemorate the 21st of March as the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And also, as you mentioned, this movement also contributed to the adoption of the first international human rights treaty that addresses the issue of racial discrimination. In fact, if you look at Article 3 of this convention, you will note that it specifically states that the world must condemn all forms of racial discrimination and apartheid, and that there is a need to ensure that there is preventative measures in place and there is a prohibition of these standards. And more recently, the Sharpeville site was declared by UNESCO as a heritage site, meaning that it has such outstanding and universal value and should be recognized as a global treasure. So it is for this reason that not only is 21 March an important day for South Africa, but it is also an important day for the rest of the world.
And yet, Ms. Noko, we find ourselves at a time where the world over, we are in a space where there is great disagreement, there's war, there's confusion. The suffering continues for many across the world, fractured by inequality, division, injustice, and of course, racism. And the question, I suppose, around racism at this point is how exactly racism undermines democracies like our own and others across the world. What are your observations as the United Nations?
Yes, of course, we are seeing, a lot of pushback on human rights. Many in the United Nations are sounding the alarm around this pushback. More recently, the High Commissioner for Human Rights has sounded the alarm. The message that we are trying to convey is that we need more human rights, not less human rights. We need to be able to build on the foundations that we already have if we want to be able to live in a world where indeed all human beings are free and equal in dignity and rights. The pushback that we are seeing is resulting in deepening inequalities, in deepening poverty, and lack of access to basic services. But the problem here is not a problem of human rights. It really is a problem of the lack of accountability for human rights. So as much as the Sharpeville Massacre contributed to a global anti-racism movement, we need to be continuously building on that anti-racism movement to address the current ills that we're seeing in the present day.
And before looking at the world more broadly, just taking the South African context, and we see it coming through in the responses to our question of the day, that responsibility of holding people accountable for a lack of human rights is something that perhaps the drafters of the Constitution would have thought would come naturally, but it hasn't. And we find ourselves in a situation and in a country where, even though our Constitution actually affords us inalienable rights, those are trampled upon daily. We have communities that don't have access to water, and this is an inalienable human right. So how do we go about holding people accountable even when our Constitution says we have these rights, where government doesn't deliver on it?
Well, I think it's important to accept and acknowledge that it starts with the recognition of the fact that these rights need to be anchored in laws and standards. And I think South Africa has translated its constitution and the provisions that it has in the constitution, whether it is on issues around racial discrimination, into domestic laws, whether that is the equality law, a broad-based economic empowerment law, labor employment laws. So there has been this effort to translate the constitutional provisions into other domestic laws and legislation. And what has to accompany that is that we need to have strong institutions that can hold people to account where human rights violations occur, whether that be in the form of the Chapter 9 institutions. The South African Human Rights Commission, for example, in this country, needs to be strengthened and given the opportunity to be able to really investigate these violations that occur and hold individuals account. The judiciary also has an important role to play. And I think we also need to recognize that the courts in South Africa are adjudicating around economic and social rights, for example, which is not the case in many other countries. Perhaps, as you say, that it is insufficient. We know that because of the triple challenges that are very known in this country. But again, I would like to emphasize that the issue is not that human rights are, human rights, the problem is with human rights. It is really this idea that we need to render them enforceable and more accountable.
And again, to that point, you look back at the Sharpeville Massacre, that watershed moment which exposed the brutality of the apartheid regime. It did strengthen and galvanize the international action against racial discrimination, but that legacy still persists, the legacy of apartheid in South Africa and across the world in various guises, one could argue, as we still try to battle racism. And this is something, a legacy that persists in our education system, in our health system, in economic opportunities that accrue to people. Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, I think this is a trend that we're seeing all over the world, really. And it is very worrying that racism is persistent. We're seeing hate speech, we're seeing dehumanizing narratives. But the point is we have to re-galvanize the movement. We have to re-galvanize the movement to stand for justice together. But we also need to address these legacies of the past in order to really overcome the decades of prejudice, of discrimination, and really consider, in some cases, special measures, as we often refer to them, or reparations. Institutionalized forms of prejudice are really found in different places and in different ways, whether through education, health, or access to basic social services. And I think it's also important that we give the young people, youth, their rightful space and place to be able to really unlock this discrimination that we're seeing in order for them to be able to contribute to a much brighter future that belongs to them. But I think, as you said, it's a scourge that continues, and it really begins with all of us taking the action that it needs and requires to speak up, to learn more about it, and to act where we see such forms of prejudices occurring.
But are we moving fast enough? Because today is the 60th anniversary of the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of radical discrimination. But the global society, if one takes a look around you, it seems as though we are moving backwards. And that seems to be a perception. I'm not sure if you agree with that, Ms. Noko. But you know, are we moving fast enough around the idea of the elimination of discrimination in its various facets, especially racism?
Well, I think since the treaty was adopted 60 years ago, I think we need to recognize that today we have 182 state parties to this treaty. And almost near universal ratification on our African continent. So there has been progress has been made. I think it's also important to emphasize that, 5 years after the Sharpeville Massacre, we had this adoption of this international treaty. What that has meant is that you have countries all over the world that, as a matter of law and practice, they have the architectures in place to be able to address this. The rollbacks that we're seeing in part are due to, the proliferation of uses of digital platforms, for example, where we're seeing this propagation of hate. And we need to have a human rights system that can catch up with the trends that are happening there. And of course, it is very worrisome, and we are sounding the alarm around some of these trends, but it doesn't take away from the fact that we have an important foundation, and that foundation needs to be built on.
Well, Ms. Noko, thank you so much for your time this morning. So much more to be discussed around these particular matters. But thanks so much to Abigail Noko, the regional representative in the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Southern Africa, helping us reflect on Human Rights Day and the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And feel free to let us know your thoughts as well at Morning Live SABC.